Welcome to Psychology of the Daf. We are in Gemara Eruvin, Daf Hey. And we're going to continue on this theme that we started yesterday, but from a different angle based on what was talked about in today's Daf. Now, today's Daf, the Gemara mentions an oft-cited principle known as Safek, Deraban, and לקולא, that if we have a Safek, if we don't know for sure whether something is prohibited or not, and the prohibition is only, and I'd like to put quotation marks around that as will come out in this discussion, that the prohibition is only rabbinic, so therefore we are lenient, the rabbis actually are lenient, and they allow one to not be concerned about it. And this application comes up in many, many places. For example, Avelis is Deraban, so Holchan Achar Hamekil in Avelis, so any halachic question, a legitimate halachic argument between two authorities, the general position is to follow the lenient rule because Avelis is midrabanan, and many, many other ways that this comes up that were more lenient by the Rabbanan. Now, we have a problem, which we quoted earlier as well, and we'll go into it a little more depth today, but there's going to be a theme over the next few daf, and perhaps in some meta-analytical way, it makes sense to have this theme because, as we noted, Maseches Eruvin is number one, a Masechta that deals almost exclusively with rabbinic ordinances, and number two, it's about boundaries, which in and of itself is kind of ontologically reflexive, meaning the entire Maseches Eruvin having to do with subject matter that is boundaries has to do with rabbinic decrees, which in and of themselves are a form of boundaries. So there's a lot of circular and self-reflective ideas within the Maseches Eruvin, and we will see over time how deeply psychological that can be, because really human process is many times also circular and self-reflective and ontological, because we are aware of ourselves, thinking about ourselves, and that's a rather unique process in creation. We can assume that a stone does not think about itself. We can probably assume that animals don't think much about themselves either, that they operate instinctually, although we wouldn't know. But if this is any comfort, we don't know anybody else is thinking about themselves either, because everybody else could simply be very, very sophisticated artificial intelligence devices that learn how to respond in appropriate ways, but are mechanistic and have no self-awareness. The only person we know for sure that has self-awareness is ourselves, which is somewhat mind-blowing, but nevertheless, that is true. We can assume that since I look like a human and people around me look like humans, so if I'm self-reflective, they must be too. But the truth is, we can never know, because it is a completely interior experience, which, by the way, makes the whole idea of trying to prove certain matters of faith complicated, because having a conviction about something is very different than having empirical evidence. So the scientific method requires empirical evidence, like 1 + 1 = 2, and needing to have some type of verification. For many, many human processes, we will never have empiric evidence, but we still absolutely have a very strong conviction that it's true. For example, the consciousness of others and the self-awareness of others is a perfect example. So when people ask you, well, how do you believe in God? That is almost as ridiculous in some respects, even though it's a legitimate question, but trying to draw a conclusion from empirical evidence is almost as ridiculous as trying to draw a conclusion that you believe in other people. Other people might be total and complete artificial intelligence simulations, and they may have absolutely no self-awareness. And the only way that you know that is true or not true is based on a conviction. You have a conviction that since you are aware of yourself, you're also aware of others, but you really can't know for sure. And so forget about believing in God. Believing in other people requires a certain leap of faith and a certain conviction. And same so too with our experience in encountering God. We may very well have interior experiences that develop a conviction within us, but that doesn't mean that we have empirical evidence. It's a very big difference. Anyway, I do digress, although I think it's a very important digression. I do digress, but what I am saying is there is a tremendous amount of circularity within human reason and self-reference, and the rabbinic function, which we're going to see, the function of the rabbis adding on decrees to the Torah, are really also in some ways self-referential and self-reflective, because they are consciously applying an external system, let's say the revelation of the Torah, and thinking how it would relate really to the human experience, and then come up with ways to develop the human experience and develop the Torah experience in a way that are most suitable. And for some reason, Hashem left that to the rabbis. And we're going to talk more about that. Now, let's get back to the original concept. The original concept is Safek Deraban לקולא, that if we have a doubt with a rabbinic rule, we are lenient. And there are many other leniencies also, like the Mekomos lo gazru. The rabbis did not hold up the obligation of their commandments in a situation of extreme duress and pain. And the question that comes up is the famous question that's first voiced by the Hasagas Ramban on Sefer Hamitzvos of the Rambam Shoresh Aleph. The Rambam holds that all dinim Derabanan are really based on the pasuk of lo sasor, thou shalt not turn away from the words of the rabbis. And he holds that basically we have an obligation to obey any edict made by the Sanhedrin. And that, so in essence, every Derabanan, every rabbinic decree is really deoraysa, because the Torah tells us we have to follow the edicts and the rulings of the Sanhedrin. And the famous question that the Ramban asks is, so why then do we have any leniencies by rabbinic rules? If it turns out that every rabbinic rule is really based on lo sasor, why should they be lenient? Now, the obvious answer that's given, and by no means the only one, which we're going to get back to, is the obvious answer that's given is that a rabbinic ordinance is based on the fiat and the declaration of the rabbis. And the rabbis had a thought that they should build in certain, what you want to call it, back doors or fail-safes, that in case the edict would be too difficult in one way or another, they decided that they could allow certain leniencies. So they basically made the decrees conditional that they be only when the prohibition is for sure, conditional that they not be in a situation where a person is under great duress. However, the issue with that is that it only covers the how. It doesn't cover the metaphysical why, meaning we now know the mechanism and how technically the rabbis could do this and could achieve this, that it could be a Torah prohibition, but still have more leniencies. The thing that we have not answered is, why would the rabbis do this? And this seems to be the Ramban's objection, because the Ramban brings this up as a potential answer, and he rejects it. And he says it's just, he basically implies that it's not reasonable. And it's hard to know exactly what he means. He gives other proofs. He says that it's very clear from the Gemara that lo sasor is only an asmachta, meaning lo sasor, do not turn away from the edicts of the Sanhedrin. That means the Sanhedrin's interpretation of the Torah. That is deoraysa. You can't disagree. You can't be a zaken mamre. You can't disagree with the ultimate decrees of the Sanhedrin having to do with interpretation or masora of deoraysa. But just a rabbinic edict like lighting Hanukkah candles or reading the Megillah or possibly muksa, things like that, that's not really in lo sasor. That's how the Ramban would look at it. And he really rejects the notion that they would make it conditional. Now, probably his reason is because of this. Again, he understood technically the rabbis can play a game and they can make the rules conditional, but he would say that there's no reason for them to do that. Why would they do that? In fact, many times you see in the Gemara, asu chizik l'divrei yosim mishal Torah. So, there are answers to that are also fairly logical. One is perhaps the rabbis felt that if the Torah was not forbidding it, they should leave room for more human experiences and exigencies that people perhaps need to be lenient about. So maybe they needed to do that. That's one possibility. The other possibility, thinking Hashem, is all wise and all knowing. So if he prohibits something or forbids something, there need not be any qualifications and conditions. But if we do, we should leave leniencies. You could say that. You could say they wanted people to see a difference between rabbinic and Torah rules because of the issue of lo baltosif, not adding on. You could argue that. However, there are other more mystical and subtle explanations for what really is the reason, and I will try to explain them because I think that they have a certain relevance to again this whole gestalt of Maseches Eruvin, this whole rabbinic interaction with Torah, and the way in which rabbinic Torah becomes Torah, as we've been discussing, and the way in which the human process itself is self-referential and reflective. So in Likutei Halachos in Hilchos Kilayim 1:9, and that is the halachic commentary on parts of Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Nosson, the Talmid of Rav Nachman Breslov. And basically, he sets up the following situation. He says that, for example, we know that Safek is permitted. We have a rule in Psak that when you have a double suffix of a certain kind, it's permitted. So, for example, the famous Safek that we have has to do with Sfiras Omer. You know that if you only miss a night, but you remember during the day, you don't make a bracha that day, but the next day you make the bracha again. And the reason is, even though making a bracha might be an issa deoraysa of Losisa Shem Hashav, which the Rambam happens to hold, that making the wrong bracha is a violation of that. But since we have a double suffix, we have one suffix, whether or not the entire counting of Sfira, all 49 days, is considered its own mitzvah and not each day a separate mitzvah. And then we also have a suffix whether or not you make the mitzvah, whether the mitzvah only can be done at night or even the next day. So since it's a double suffix, when you come to the next day already, if you didn't forget an entire day, then you're only dealing with double suffix. On the basis of that, you can count Sfiras Omer. That's one of the famous Sfekas. Of course, there's many in Hilchos Kashrus. Now, when you have a double suffix, what's the reason that a double suffix is permitted? So the poskim say, Pashtus, it's al pi rov. The famous rule in the Torah is we follow the majority. So when you have a double suffix, essentially you have 4 permutations. 3 of the permutations are on the permitted side. Only 1 is on the forbidden side, because you need to have many conditions to be met in order for it to be forbidden. So since the majority of the conditions, since there's a double suffix, and the majority of the conditions are on the side of permitted, so therefore it's permitted. So here's where Rabbi Nosson goes with that. Rabbi Nosson takes it further, and he says the way to look at rabbinic versus deoraysa is that in the deoraysa there is no ambiguity. There's no ambiguity. Hashem says it's asur, it's asur. Hashem says it's mutter, it's mutter. It's a revelation. There's no ambiguity. When it comes to a rabbinic decree, there's a degree of ambiguity, both because it is still created by human beings, and second of all, that perhaps even if everything about this rabbinic decree is appropriate and correct, again, there are different exigencies and different situations where it might not be appropriate, right? Only a divine source could make a law and know that this law is good everywhere. So, even though we have exceptions to the rule for that too, like in situations of pikuach nefesh or what have you, but that's built in too. But the point is that a rabbinic decree always has a degree of ambiguity associated with it. And so Rabbi Nosson cleverly says that basically every suffix Deraban is really a Sfek metaphysically. He doesn't really mean it's a suffix, but what he means to say is that there's a double ambiguity. There is the ambiguity of maybe this Isser that I think is us or is not, because I have a genuine suffix. I don't know if this piece, let's say this piece is rabbinically prohibited, but I'm not sure if it really had that rabbinically prohibited ingredient in it or not. So I have one suffix, and then there's the general ambiguity that this is a non-Torah prohibition, and perhaps for whatever reason, metaphysically, it doesn't apply over here. So when you have the mix of 2 ambiguities, it essentially becomes mutter. Basically, he's saying that a a regular Safek Deraban is really a Safek. Not because the rabbis weren't sure in a empirical sense that they knew what they were saying, but that there's a degree of ambiguity, and double ambiguity is permitted according to the Torah because there's a majority of ambiguity over non-ambiguity. Very interesting, very interesting. Now, Rav Hirsch Melech Shapiro in Agra Dekala takes this concept. He uses a very similar process of comparing it to Sveka and comparing it to a rabbinic decree that there's also some kind of Sveka, but he develops it in a different direction, more metaphysically. And he says as follows. He says that there's a medrash in Vayikra Rabbah Perkov Daled Os Tes, where it says, Kadoshim Tiyu, you shall be holy. The medrash says, Yochel Kamoni, I might think that you have to be holy like me. But no, it says, Kedushasi Lamalam B'Kedushaschem, I am holier than you. And basically, the limud over there is that the implication, the way that he understands it, is that rabbinic decrees can't be as strong as deoraysa decrees. And he explains the reasoning is as follows. There's two ways in which Hashem makes himself known in the world. Hashem makes himself known in the world through outright miracles, like splitting of the Red Sea. And then there's the ordinary teva. There's the fact that things happen every day that are miraculous, but we don't recognize them as miraculous. Hopefully soon they're going to come up with a vaccine for the coronavirus. On the one hand, it's just science, whatever that means. But on the other hand, do we know in what ways humans were inspired by God to find that vaccine? And furthermore, human intellect itself is its own miracle, as we were talking about in the beginning of this discussion. Human intellect is an amazing process. That itself is a miracle. So we have two kinds of ways that Hashem manifests himself in the world: the nigla and the nister, the outright miracle, and the ways in which he's hidden in teva. And when Hashem does something, especially when you look at things in a mystical angle, there is always a constant recurrence. In other words, if it's true, if it's a pattern, that this is the way Hashem does something, then that's the way Hashem does something everywhere, because it's in emanating spheres of repetition and spirals and cycles of almost like ripples in a pond, that they keep repeating themselves and widening their way. So if this is the way Hashem manifests himself in the world, in these two ways, in an outright way and a hidden way, so the rabbis understood that their takanas have to operate in that way too. And this is where it gets very interesting. If you're able to follow, and I hope you find this interesting, basically the way the rabbis saw it was, if Hashem put it in the Torah, well then it's the explicit. So that's the function of it being completely deoraysa, because that function is explicit. That's the same thing as being something that is totally an outright miracle. Now, Hashem left the rest for man, just like Hashem left man to develop the coronavirus vaccine. Hashem left for the rabbis to develop aspects of the Torah that need development according to their wisdom, according to their situation. That's considered more of the hidden hand of Hashem. So, the way the rabbis needed to make it was, if they made every one of their takanas, even though, based on the Maharal and the Ber Hagolah, which he quotes, even though really every Deraban is deoraysa too, in a very deep sense, it's the will of Hashem, and it's based on Losasar, but it's based even more on Losasar. The Ber Hagolah it develops this theme very deeply, that there are Torah truths. Like a truth is, for example, always do chesed. Now that Torah truth, or there's a truth, covered Shabbos. That concept is deep. Muksa is a rabbinic enactment of a deeper Torah truth. In other words, everybody's going to agree that covered Shabbos is deoraysa. Everybody's going to agree doing chesed is deoraysa. But Nichem Avelim, which is Deraban, is an expression of the Torah truth. The rabbis had the ability to enact the deep Torah truth. And every rabbinic edict is really an enactment of Torah truth, and therefore it's deoraysa. But going back to this idea over here that we're developing, what we're saying over here is that the rabbis, because they realized that Hashem wanted an aspect of the Torah to be more hidden and be more derech teva. They had to make it appear contingent. They had to make it appear just like nature itself, that if you're looking for it, you'll see it. If you're not looking for it, you won't see it. And he actually quotes the pasuk of Yisharim Darchei Hashem, the ways of Hashem are straight. Tzadikim yelchu bo, the tzadikim will go in it. V'rishoyim yikashlu bo, and evil people will stumble. Meaning the person's going to look at the world, and if they want to, they're going to see Hashem. If they don't want to, they won't see Hashem. In fact, they'll see the opposite, and they'll stumble. So even with the rabbinic decrees, the rabbis did not want to present them as Torah. The rabbis wanted to present them as a rabbinic expression, even though deep down, just like the coronavirus vaccine is really coming from God, but it doesn't appear that way, so too the rabbinic decrees don't appear to be coming from Hashem, even though they really are. Now, what's the upshot of all this? The upshot is that I think we're beginning to see, and like I said, this is going to be a repeated pattern in many areas in Maseches Eruvin. We're going to see that in the Teva itself, Hashem is taking a step back. Just like we saw yesterday, heaven and earth cannot meet, because it's not just, Hashem is doing it to test us. That's why he doesn't show himself. No, because Hashem, we saw in some earlier psychologies of the Daf, the Rambam, who holds in the Mareh, I think it's Perek Shalish, part 3, Perek Lamed Aleph, I believe. We'll check that out for the Mareh Mekomos, but the point is that Hashem doesn't make tests to test people, according to the Rambam. Anyway, we'll see about that a little bit more too. But the point is that Hashem cannot be there. Heaven and earth cannot meet, because if heaven meets earth, earth loses its quality. Man cannot encounter God fully. If he does, he will not be man. Materialism and spirituality cannot fully blend, otherwise materialism disappears and becomes absorbed into God. So we need a Torah that is structured in the same way. We need a life that is structured in the same way, where we create, where we build, where we do, where we enact. And the rabbis were simply following this pattern that God already indicated is the way we need to be in the world. There are things that are outright miracles on occasion, and then there are things that need to be found, need to be discovered. You need to find God in the details. And we're going to hear more about that tomorrow when we talk about Bas Kol.